I want to start my talk with an historical analogy. And I'm mindful, one of the professors I had when I was a student here many years ago, Roberto Lopez, had a saying that I heard once, I've repeated probably 10,000 times, and its wisdom never escapes me. And that was the warning: history never repeats itself, said Professor Lopez. It only appears to do so to those who do not pay attention to details. Our situation is always new. But I want to invoke this analogy not as an example of history repeating itself, but as a way of thinking about something. And a way of thinking about something that may be a little uncomfortable for some of the people in this room. As Professor Snyder said, it is often difficult to see things when you are in them. So I'm about to talk about something that many of the people in this room are in. In the years after World War II, the United States and its democratic friends face an extremist challenge in the force of a global communist movement, both abroad and at home. And this movement worked both by external subversion and by internal revolutionary activity. It was weaker in the United States than in many other places, but people didn't really know that. It was hard to have a good sense of the scope of how intense this danger was. And in many places of the world, this danger was obviously very extreme. It took over by force, where the Soviet armies had been, and it worked by subversion in places like Czechoslovakia, and nearly so in France and Italy. The governments of the Western world, the democratic world, met this challenge with two basic tactics. The first was a policy of confrontation, often armed confrontation, that communist armies were met by containment, deterrence, and sometimes outright conflict. Communist movements inside the countries were subjected to a great deal of repression. But they joined this policy of confrontation to a policy of concession. That where communist parties were battening on authentic grievances, these grievances were met with concessions, of which the two most important were decolonization. Communist parties were often strong in colonized areas. Especially at the pressure of the United States, colonized areas were decolonized, and through the building of social insurance states after World War II. The fear of unemployment and old age and poverty in sickness. These were real feelings that people had. And if the only people who would offer a solution to that problem were the communists, then people would turn to the communists. We face, in the Western world, not just in the United States, but in Europe as well, a new extremist movement. And we can call it the alt-right, we can call it nationalist populism, we can call it neo-fascism, we can call it whatever we want. The grievance it feeds on is the cultural and economic shock of mass migration from the poor world to the Western world. I think the consensus of many people on the liberal side is that the way to deal with this extremist movement is with a policy of confrontation only. They are wrong, they must be scolded, and they must be told that they are completely mistaken, and no concessions at all. And so in describing the ways in which the Trump administration is dangerous, its attitude toward immigration has been taken not as a source of its strength, but as its most odious marker and the thing to be most militantly confronted. And I would like to suggest that we think about this in a different way, and that we find in dealing with the grievances that animate the rising tide of extremism across the Western world some of the wisdom of the generation of 1945 to 1960, and understand there are some concessions that have to be made here if you want to move away the sources of power and dynamism and strength from the extremist movements that threaten your democratic institutions. I notice when this is a hard thought to process. Daniel Zilblatt, whose book I so lavishly reviewed and whose wisdom I really cherish and admire, in his list of norm violations in the run-up to Donald Trump, I'm a Republican, so I noticed it was a kind of Democratic-heavy list. All the norm violations were committed by Republicans. And I will admit the situation is asymmetric, that what the Republicans have done in the period from 2000 to 2016 was more and worse than what the Democrats did, and in particular the threat to put the United States into default unless they won their every single demand they had in the budget negotiation. That was an unprecedented thing and really dangerous, a mark of how this country is tumbling down the stairs toward ever more extreme behaviors, ever more willingness to contemplate out of the ordinary measures in order to get your way. But here's runner-up to that, the second most important norm violation of the period, or the second most important executive branch, second most important norm violation, the most important executive branch norm violation, was President Obama's immigration orders. You'll remember that in Obama's first term, he was repeatedly pressed, can you do some kind of executive action on the illegal alien population? I took a tally. I've written a book about this. I have found, and I'm not a great researcher, 6 specific instances where President Obama described this action as illegal, as a violation of presidential authority, as something that was absolutely not to be thought of. I'm not a king, he would say. I do not have this power. But as the 2012 election got closer and closer, and as he became more nervous, because you'll remember, 2012, we had the economy looked really strong in the early part of 2011, and then it began to slow down in the second half of 2011. In the early parts of 2012, it looked like the economy might be stalling, and so it might be an incumbent, unfriendly moment. President Obama issued the first, and 2 years later, before the 2014 elections, he issued the second of an executive order that legalized, in one case, about 800,000 people, and in the second case, a group of about 5 million people, in a way that he himself had described as lawless. And the courts agreed, by the way. The 2012 measure is still on the books, but the 2014 measure was thrown out by district courts, circuit courts, and then by a 4-4 decision of the United States Supreme Court. Why is that so important? That issue, that sense that the barriers of the country were down, was a powerfully animating force in the Donald Trump campaign. That's obvious. After it was all over, after the campaign ended and Donald Trump was elevated to the presidency, the immigration debate was reported on according to a certain convention. This is the way we would write about it. If you could identify that the person complaining about mass migration had somehow been an economic loser, their wages had been impinged on, or they'd been crowded out of an emergency room, then the complaint was fair. If it was about money, you could complain. If it was a sense of cultural displacement, or loss of power or status or prestige, absolutely out of bounds. And if it was a sense of, I'm a citizen, and it means something, then you're dealing with a racist or a cranker or worse. One of the things that, as we contemplate the strength of democracy and this vulnerability of democracy, we have to take more seriously, in my opinion, than we have done, the connection that was argued in the 19th century between the nation state and democratic modes of government. We have not found a way, and I don't think we ever will, to do democratic government in any way other than through nation states. Nation states made of citizens, nation states with borders. The nation state did not have a very good run in the period from 1914 to 1945, and not even then, better, but still in many ways to be left something to be desired run from 1945 to 1989. And so many people of goodwill saw the answer to the problems of our time was to weaken the nation state in favor of broader attachments to humanity. What we discovered instead, as we've dissolved it, what we are discovering is that people do not move from citizenship bonds to broader bonds, but to narrower bonds, to ethnicity and to race. And that is what is happening in Europe, and that is what is happening here. Our topic today is what is to be done, and there's a lot to be said. But I think a new politics of the center meets the slogan, America first, with all its ugly associations, with a doctrine of Americans first. And that means doing some things that draw from the traditional political left, that is strengthening the material connections between citizens and state, in particular by re-thickening the social welfare state in the American context, especially in the area of health. But it also means strengthening the idea of citizenship by putting citizenship first and drawing more sharply the line between those who belong to the polity and those who don't, those who have entered the polity in legitimate ways and those who have sought entry in illegitimate ways, and enforcing that barrier to make it clear to all that the people who have done well in a world in which fewer and fewer do well still remember the people who have not done so well. Thank you.
Look, obviously, economic stagnation, income stagnation is a very important part of where these movements come from. But I will note that the second best, in the entire developed world, the country with the second best performance after Canada for its middle class is Germany. If you look at quintiles of income, the German middle quintile has done better than anybody's except Canada. And we've just seen a collapse of the German parties in the center and the rise of German parties of the extremist right and left in the wake of the biggest migration shock in German history. Probably you can cope with a lot of migration if your economies are doing great. And probably if your economies are not doing so great, and especially middle-income people are not, and you restrict your immigration, you can buy some stability. It's the combination. I agree with Yash, although I would refine with his three factors. It is economic stagnation for middle-income people, the increasing levels of ethnic diversity, so there's less social trust. And I would say, instead of social media, I would point to the aging of the baby boom generation, which means that you have rising claims on resources, public and private, at the same time as you have fewer resources to go around and less willingness to share because of an increasingly diverse population. Basically, I see what political elites have been doing since about 2000 is applying a series of pain tests to their population. How much pain can we administer before you do something? We're going to take away your money. We're going to raise questions about the reliability of your pensions and health care, and we're going to change your countries in ways you were never consulted about and that you're not going to like, and that we're going to call you names about if you object to them.
Francis.
I just want to say, as we reflect on what...
I'll be brief. I invite people, and this is maybe a response to what Yasha just said, to ask yourself, what are you trying to accomplish here? If what you're trying to accomplish is, how do we strengthen the left? That's one answer. If you're saying, how do we strengthen democratic norms? That's quite a different answer. And there's been a tendency to blur them. I'm not a person of the left at all, so I'll just give you from my outsider's view. You want to strengthen the left, the way you do it is by ramping up, is by building up a coalition of minorities. That's the best democratic mobilization, build up racial antagonism, Black Lives Matter. Those, because the reason that the reason the 2016 election was abnormal was by the normal political science indicators. Hillary Clinton should have won 53% of the vote. The fact that she got 48 is abnormal. She lost 5 points in a very incumbent-friendly environment. Why? Failure to mobilize black voters, partly because of voter suppression, partly because she wasn't offering them much of anything. Medicare for all, that's how you build the left. But what you will discover when you do that is the candidates who lead that will be Trumps of the left. Not as gross.
Bernie Sanders, for example?
Like Bernie Sanders, who was good at his job, yeah. But those they will be norm tramplers. They will do things like Obama's executive actions in his second term. That's what you'll get. That is a way to a more social democratic United States. It'll be an ethnically driven way. If what you want to do, if your question is how do we build democratic norms, that's a different question. And then you have to say this is not about party advantage, and that means that some of the people you're going to have to address the things that are driving the corrosion of democratic norms. What do you think of this? You interview a voter, and you say, "Why did you vote for Trump?" And the voter said, "Well, I'm just really disappointed at what has happened to my personal living standard. I haven't had a wage increase in 20 years." You say, "You are so greedy and materialistic. Don't you understand that money is the root of all evil?" I conjure you, I order you to lay aside these crass, okay? But that is the sermon that they get if they say, I'm unhappy that my neighborhood, which used to be 100% English speaking, now has 30% English second language learners in my children's school. And that will happen. I went to a school in North Carolina when I was researching a book in 2007 where a family reported the change from no foreign language speakers to 30% over the course of their 3 children's time in that one school district. Find out what is bothering people and do something about it. And take the grievances seriously. Joseph Schumpeter is deeply out of style, but it had a big impact on me. It seems to me that democratic systems get into trouble in 2 ways. One is what populism is the people identify the problems and the people offer the solutions. Bad. Elitism is the people identify problems, the elites tell them they're wrong about them, and offer other problems and other solutions. Also bad. Listen to the problems, then use partisan competition to compete to offer responsible solutions, but do not read the problems out of court.